Greetings, and welcome to Theology Thursdays. We continue with N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, with Chapter 8. We kind of foreshadowed Chapter 8 in last week's discussion of Chapter 7 because he brings up the second coming of Christ as it relates to the ascension. However, something that N.T. Wright wants to get straight before we start talking specifically about what the second coming means for the universe as a whole, or at least for us specifically, we need to get straight what exactly the second coming is. Now, this might seem like splitting hairs, but what exactly happens in the second coming as it comes to the way that you understand it? In the second coming, are Christians snatched away from earth to be with Jesus up in the heavenly realms? Well, when we start talking about the second coming, we have to, as N.T. Wright wants to suggest, we have to go first to the biblical roots of the eschaton, the end of all things. And in that discussion of the biblical concept of the end, we have to take, perhaps at face value, the way that the Old Testament and New Testament treat the order of events that will happen. And even more specifically, to treat the direction of events that will happen. One of the most common directions that we can assume in our culture is that we are going to meet Jesus. Now, there are a couple of key Pauline passages that seem to suggest this. However, N.T. Wright is going to put Paul's words in a brand new, or I should say, in an original context, and will push back against this idea that we are going to where Jesus is, but rather is going to combine the sources that we have within the Old Testament and New Testament and say it is in fact the more biblical view that God is going to come to us. And that simple difference in direction, us going up or God coming down, actually means something very drastically different when it comes to what exactly the second coming means. So if we are to maybe re-examine the direction of the second coming, why is that important, and what do we learn by that? When it comes to Jesus' coming, what evokes in our minds in that language is the idea of Jesus being here, of Jesus' presence. Now, if you remember from last chapter, we initially talked about presence as having several different dimensions to it. But to put it just plainly, presence and the presence of Christ actually has far more to do with how we understand the second coming than we might at first think. Because we have to put ourselves in a different cultural context and in a different linguistic context. Because the words that we're using to describe what happens, presence of Jesus, the second coming of Jesus, and so on and so forth, are, to put it just plainly, English terms that we're using. And anybody who studied languages knows that there's never really a one-to-one equivalence between certain concepts or terms in language. They always have other freights of meaning behind them that have contours to them that don't translate. So when we talk about the second coming of Christ and the presence of Christ, we don't get the entire context of what those original words are meaning, which is why we have to do word studies. Now, N.T. Wright is a New Testament scholar, and N.T. Wright is not in any way out of his element in doing word studies. This is something that we have to do all the time when it comes to biblical studies. But for you who might have not done any of these things, a word study is simply taking the term that we have in its original language, that we have in the texts that we have of the New Testament or the Old Testament, looking at the context in which these words are used in their historical context, but also in their linguistic context. In other words, where has this word been used, not only just in the Bible, but also in other contexts that are around that? For example, the New Testament is primarily written in something called Koine Greek. Koine simply means common Greek, as opposed to classical Greek. It's kind of like how we have different dialects of English that aren't necessarily the same as each other. We have English that is spoken within the United States, but we also have English that's spoken in the British Isles. They are the same in a lot of ways, but different in some pretty key ways as well. But Koine Greek has its own cultural context. When Koine Greek uses a certain word, it also has a history of meaning that can stretch back to classical Greek. This is where, of course, we did the word study over the anastasis, the resurrection, and where anastasis shows up not just in the Bible, but in other sources, in the Greek poets and so on and so forth. Well, there is another concept that we have to do a word study over in order to get the full contextual meaning behind what the New Testament is actually talking about when it means presence and when it means the coming. So when we talk about presence, what exactly do we mean by presence? And how exactly do we conceive of presence? To use Wright's own example in this, we know that the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening. But we also know that that is more or less metaphorical speech rather than true speech, because if we talked or if we asked ourselves, what do we mean by that? We then have to get into the more correct frame of mind that actually, it's not really that the sun is doing the rising and the setting, it's more that the Earth is revolving around the sun in our solar system. So that is, of course, the more correct way of describing that we are revolving around the sun and we are simply turning as the Earth. But we still have those figures of speech that are still clearly logical in the way that we're talking about things, even though they're not really the complete truth about the world. They are shortcuts of meaning, so to speak, and shortcuts in meaning that go back many, many, many years. Well, just as we can relate that the sun rising and setting is a shortcut for talking about something that's a little bit more complex, so also we can talk about the second coming and the presence of Christ, as Christ is present with us, and the second coming is when Jesus will come again, as shortcuts for talking about something that is far more complex than at its outset. And to get at that, we have to actually start looking at some various biblical texts that are being brought into the forefront and used by either Christ himself in the Gospels, or by the Acts narrative, or by Paul, who writes most of the letters of the New Testament. We have to situate ourselves in the ways in which the Bible talks about how the end of time will come. And to begin, we have to talk about Jesus' own words when Jesus speaks about when you see the Son of Man coming again in the clouds with great glory. Let's talk about that one first, so that we have a jumping off point as to maybe what the rest of the New Testament might be inferring from this text. First of all, when Jesus talks about him coming again in the clouds, he is actually quoting an actual book of the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 7 refers to the coming again in the clouds. And when you look at Daniel chapter 7, you will notice that the Son of Man reference that is being used by Jesus throughout the New Testament and by Daniel specifically in the Old Testament, this is not referring to someone who is up here and the rest of the people right here coming up here, but rather it is a metaphor for the rescuing of Israel from captivity. In other words, it is a metaphor in Daniel of God coming down to earth to rescue the captive people of Israel from the nations around them and to gather them back up. This is a reference directionally of God coming down this way. This is very important because when Jesus brings up this context, Jesus is likely understanding that the metaphorical context and the directional context of this passage that Jesus is using is a God down to earth context. And rather than there being a in the clouds up here and people getting sucked up this direction, so to speak, rather there is an inauguration, or to use N.T. Wright's words, a vindication of Jesus himself coming down this direction. Because what N.T. Wright brings up is that this reference is so often taken as a second coming reference, of an end of the age reference, but rather Wright wants to suggest in its original context, Jesus is referring to what will happen when he is resurrected on the third day, not at the end of the age. Rather, that this passage of the coming again in power and great glory is a reference to the resurrection on the third day. Now, if we take that particular contextualization of this and put it in its place, that gives us an entirely different sort of feel to that passage. Jesus speaking of his coming in power and great glory on the clouds as a reference to this idea of his vindication at the resurrection, that gives it a very different feel than this someday maybe at the end of the age. The other thing that needs to be talked about is that some of the parables of Jesus are sometimes interpreted as applying to Jesus's leaving and coming back. Take, for example, the parable of the talents, where you have a master who entrusts money, large sums of money, to his servants, and then leaves country. And then, when he comes back, makes a reconciliation with those who were in charge of his finances. Now, a common application of these things is that, well, this is a metaphor for when Jesus goes away, entrusts people with the talents or the finances that he does, and then he comes back again. However, in the context in which Jesus tells these parables, there was already a very robust tradition of understanding how business practices were done. And in this particular business practice, one of the ways in which these stories were understood early on, because remember, Jesus is telling these parables before his crucifixion and resurrection. And as we talked about in chapters past, the Jewish hearers that Jesus was talking to had no reason to think that he would be bodily resurrected in the age. That was something that happens at the end of time. So how would they have heard this story? Well, the way that they would have heard this story was actually as a metaphor for God coming to save Israel, just like the Son of Man references in Daniel. God had entrusted these things and had left in some ways. And it was a symbol of God coming back to reconcile and rescue Israel from captivity. You can see echoes of this in the ways in which these people entrusted with these finances are doing as best as they can with what has been done. The wicked being the one who buries his master's treasure and therefore is thrown out of the covenant, which, by the way, contextually might be a reference to a certain religious organization that Jesus was having to deal with in that time, let the reader understand. But those stories would have had an immediate context that was about God coming to Israel. Now think about what that would have meant for Jesus's own identity. In other words, if you read the parables in that way of God coming back to Israel to reconcile with them, who fulfills that? It's Jesus himself. The parables can be read in a way that is about Jesus coming back the first time, not the second coming. In other words, the parables Wright wants to suggest has just as applicative, if not a more applicative meaning in their original context of Jesus coming the first time rather than the second time. And so what Wright wants to say is that we need to be very, very cautious about taking these parables as if they are talking about a second coming, but rather that these parables are references to the first coming of Jesus, specifically in the reconciliation aspect of Jesus setting the scales aright. And so when we talk about those passages, we need to be very aware of their original contexts. Daniel chapter 7, referring to God coming to Israel, and in Jesus' context, telling these parables before we ever get to the crucifixion and resurrection. So we have to be a little careful about those applications. But more specifically, we have to be a little more careful with the way that later New Testament authors understand what Jesus in the Old Testament is saying, because it might be drastically different from what we actually have inherited as meanings that they may have meant. Because if Jesus isn't necessarily talking about his second coming, but rather his first coming in the reconciliation he's about to do, the second coming of Christ is what the rest of the New Testament deals with, specifically St. Paul. Now, again, this is not to say that the second coming was just made up. No, this was something that Paul receives as a tradition from the apostles. And as we can see in the book of Acts, the angels that are at the ascension when the disciples are looking up into heaven, the angels basically say, hey, you guys go and wait to be clothed with power from on high. Just like he said, he will come again in the same way you saw him go. So now we get to this particular directional aspect, because that subtle hint right here is you will see him come again in the same way that he goes. Well, if he goes up to the clouds, out of their sight, guess what direction he's coming back to? This way, right? He's not bringing us up that way. He's coming down this way, okay? So again, directionally, we still have that same direction. This way, God comes to earth. Now, for St. Paul, there are a couple of passages that have been used as a particular proof texting, particularly those who are dispensationalists in rapture theology, that the church is going to be caught up out of the world. Now, Wright wants to suggest this is a fundamental misunderstanding as to what Paul means in a couple of key passages. Let's examine them piece by piece. In the two key passages that we're going to talk about, specifically in Paul's letter to the church at Thessalonica and in the first letter to the church at Corinth, we have a particular word used that Wright is going to say is easily mistranslated and can lead people astray by the translation. And that word is parousia. Parousia is a word that is most usually rendered coming, the coming of the Lord. Specifically in the passage, when the Lord comes again, he will be coming on the clouds, and we will be caught up together with him up there. The coming of the Lord on the clouds, that word coming is the word in Greek parousia. That word can be rendered coming, but carries with it a very important other context in which that word occurs. For example, this word does not simply occur in these two passages of Paul, but all over the place within the Greek New Testament. And this word is referential in a specific fashion. Number one, this word is referential as to presence, just as much as it means the coming of something. The parousia, that word, can also be rendered just as easily and just as contextually as the presence of someone. So the presence of Christ is manifest in this fashion, rather than Jesus coming as if in a particular directional sort of way. The presence of Christ is more of, we would say, the manifestation of something. But it has an even further context than that. It's not really a presence, but it is a royal presence, a noble presence, an imperial presence, perhaps. I used this example about 5 chapters ago, but when we hear this reference in 1 Corinthians, that we will be caught up to meet Christ in the clouds, there is a really important other word that is used here as well. Notice that the word meet is used. M-E-E-T. We are going to meet Christ in the clouds. It does not say that we are going to go and live or we're going to go somewhere else, but rather we are going to meet Christ. Now, why is this important? Because in the immediate context, we will meet Christ in the clouds and we will be with him forever. This is language that Paul is using in his immediate context, very likely to picture a Roman processional. Now, a Roman processional is when a particular dignitary, usually the emperor, is passing through a particular town or city. When the procession of this royal entourage comes through a particular place, the people of the city and the people of the town customarily go out to meet this royal person and then usher them in to the town or city that they're in. Can you guess where another Roman processional happens in the Gospels? The triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. The triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem is a royal processional because remember, Jesus enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey. The people meet Jesus on the road and they lay down their garments and they hold palm branches. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It is a meeting of Christ on the road, but it's not the final destination. Jesus is coming into Jerusalem. And so the thing is that is clearly in that imperial context. Paul is using the same imperial imagery that when Jesus comes, when Jesus parousias, when the presence of Jesus is manifest, we will meet him in the clouds, but in the same fashion as we would meet Jesus in the triumphal entry. We would gather together to meet Christ, to usher Christ in to our city of earth, so to speak. So the concept of, again, directionality, God down here, is still preserved in this passage and also in the Thessalonians passage. When Paul brings up the parousia, Paul is not meaning that Jesus is coming to get us to go away. Rather, what Paul is meaning in that is that this particular parousia is an imperial royal meeting and ushering in of the reign of Christ forever. You see how that's a very different sort of interpretation than Jesus coming to get us and going away. But Wright wants to suggest this is actually the truest biblical meaning of this whole metaphor of the parousia. And so in these key Pauline passages, as well as other passages within the New Testament, such as in the passages of 1 John and in other later New Testament authors, we have, as Wright wants to suggest, and puts a lot of effort into trying to do this convincingly, we want to re-examine the popular notion of Jesus coming to get us and going somewhere else, but rather that Jesus is coming as the noble, the emperor of the world, to use Paul's Roman analogy, and that this ushering in of Jesus means that Jesus coming in his second parousia means that Christ is inhabiting the very presence, power, and place in the real world at the eschaton, the end of time. And this is an important key factor because of the directionality of this. We don't see us down here going up there. Rather, in its more closely tied historical context, we have God in the dimension of heaven coming to earth, the dimension of humanity. And so, to even use it in a more particular fashion, that is in fact what God does in Christ Jesus, right? That's what the incarnation's all about. God comes to us. But even more ancient than that, the Old Testament is all about God coming to people, not people going to God. God comes to Abraham and says, "Go to a place I'll show you." God meets Jacob when Jacob is sleeping at Bethel and shows him the ladder to heaven. God comes again to Jacob and wrestles with him and names him Israel, the one who has struggled with God. God comes to King Solomon and says, "What shall I give you?" Solomon asks for wisdom. God comes to Isaiah in the vision of the throne room. "Whom shall I send?" Isaiah says, "Lord, here am I, send me." And likewise, God comes to us ultimately in Christ Jesus, the only begotten Son of God. That is the direction always and all throughout the Bible is God to us. And likewise in the second parousia of Christ, that direction remains the same.